Now we've had a basic overview of the three parts of juggling. We started with the objects, then we did the body and the rhythm. With the objects, we were moving our bodies because we wanted to throw under the leg or around our legs in different ways. But we were moving the bodies because of how we wanted to have the object travel through space and what kind of path we wanted the object to take. So we were moving our bodies in relationship to the idea from the object. But then after that, we did the work with the body where the juggling didn't change at all, and we were only changing how the body moved. And then finally, of course, we looked at rhythm, where that's how we can organize the body alongside the objects. And as well, we talked a little bit about visual rhythm and what that might mean inside of a sequence instead of the rhythm that you hear. And we're going to get to more about that later on, because when we did the work before with rhythm, it's really a lot about the rhythm that you hear as a starting point for how to understand rhythm and how to learn rhythm and how to use rhythm inside your juggling. But of course we want to transform that into actual juggling and not just be stuck on this idea of music or some sort of sound focus. So now that we have an overview of all of the parts of juggling, we're going to go back into each category again, the objects, body, and rhythm, and we're going to look a little bit deeper into what those things mean, into one more step forward with all of that work. Because again, so far, we've done a lot of things with one ball, or even three balls, but everything we've done with one ball, for example, I don't think any of you really work with one ball in that way in your lives. That's not the point of your juggling. So these ideas we're working on, we should translate them into something more that's more personal, or has more technique, or has more meaning in your lives. And now that we have this overview, I want to take one step further in each direction to understand a little bit better how we can translate this work into ideas that are more relevant to you in your everyday life with practicing juggling. So let's start again with objects. And again, we had this idea that an object is the size, shape, weight, color, material, how many are there, and what are they doing? What kind of patterns are they moving in? And I'd like to tell you a little bit about a project that I made many years ago, and then we're going to work with some of those ideas inside of that project. And the project was called the Manipulation Research Laboratory. We did 3 of these. And the reason the Manipulation Research Laboratory started was because I was going to a lot of juggling festivals and I got asked to teach workshops, and people said, oh, can you teach us how to juggle? We want to juggle good, we want to, whatever that means. We want to be creative, whatever that means. And I had to start to figure out what these people really actually wanted. Because of course you can understand if someone comes to you and says, oh, can you teach me? I want to juggle better. Then you have to understand on what level, what do they mean better? I mean, technically, sure, if they want to do 6 balls instead of 5 balls, that's very easy to understand. But if they're talking about creativity or innovation or something else, aesthetics, or some other quality other than technique, it's kind of really hard to put into words. Or at least it was back then. I think it still is now, but it's easier now that we made this project. But my starting point was, okay, they want to juggle better, so what does that mean better? And what does juggling mean in general? Then we can understand, if we know what juggling is, we're going to know if it's going to be better or worse than it was before. But if we don't have a starting point for juggling, how are we ever going to know that we're juggling better? And so I started to try to teach some workshops into how to do some of these newer techniques, because I thought also, again, technique is a concrete starting point for juggling. It's not so interpretive. I mean, either you throw the ball behind your back or you don't. Whether somebody likes that or not is subjective, but you can't argue that the ball went behind your back if you're throwing a back cross. And so in this way, I thought, okay, in the past 10 years, there's been a lot of new juggling techniques that have come out. Let's say with clubs. You have a lot of traps, rolls, hits, bounces, and those things didn't exist when I started out juggling 30 years ago. So I thought, okay, that's a nice starting point to have this idea that we're going to teach juggling that's going to be good or better somehow. We can start with all of the new techniques. And I did a few workshops where we learned these new techniques, and then we tried to compose some juggling, and it was going to be really good, right? Because we had this new technique and we had this new idea. But kind of the same result happened that happens every single time, regardless of technique or not. Some of the sequences were good, and some of them were bad. And looking back on that, some of these ideas that I discovered were obvious, of course now that I know them, but at the time it was really hard to understand. For example, in terms of technique, you can say that a juggler who's just starting out, they don't have a lot of skill, so they're pretty limited in what they can say with their technique. Their technique is really specific in a certain direction. For example, if they're right-handed or left-handed, a lot of their technique is limited by that fact alone. So if you watch a juggler who just started to learn to juggle, and you say, okay, we're going to make some good juggling now, and make a juggling sequence that's good. Well, they're going to do some juggling where their right hand, they're going to do the cascade maybe, and they're going to throw under the arm, and they're going to throw behind the back, and they're going to throw under the leg, and everything's happening with the right hand, and nothing's happening with the left hand, because they haven't invested the time yet to learn things with the left hand. That's as well a little bit inside of our juggling culture. It's not really promoted from the beginning that everything has to be done really exactly equally with both hands. And even artistically later on, that also seems to be an idea that might be popular, that the hands can remain unequal, whereas sometimes if you're thinking about the more, you could say sports juggling, or juggling, you say from many years ago, you could start to say, okay, there is some sort of respect or validation that you can get from your peers or from your friends if you can do behind the back with both hands. But nowadays, I don't know if that's really relevant anymore, at least artistically. And so you start to see these sequences that these beginning jugglers would make where it's really unbalanced. So for example, I could start to say very technically, all of the action, really in one way, is happening with just one hand, only on one side. And as well, these new techniques of manipulation where people are doing less throwing. So it's more body contact where the clubs, for example, are rolling or being trapped and they're not being released into the air. It started to make a little bit more sense, again looking backwards, that if you have a 3-club sequence, it's really easy then to do some manipulation and take one of the clubs and I put it down on my foot, and then I have the other 2 clubs and I do a bunch of stuff with the 2 clubs because it's much easier. I only have 2 clubs, I only have to take care of 2 objects, and the third object is basically sitting on the floor, more or less. And then every once in a while, oh yeah, I have a 3rd club. Then you get the 3rd club back, and then you start to do some more 3-club stuff, but then that one goes away, maybe to your elbow, and you do some more 2-club stuff. And so in this way, I started to notice very technically that these sequences of juggling that were on one hand good, and on the other hand, or bad, depending on where they fell on that spectrum, I started to notice that the ones that were good, maybe there was some quality about them where the relationship of all of the objects was more equal than unbalanced. So for example, it's not a technical issue of respect or some sort of measurement of skill that the hands would juggle equally in terms of where's the initial action or where's the focus. But I did tend to notice that the sequences that I thought were good did have some sort of quality where both the left and the right side had a relationship at least. I'm not saying they were equal, but there seemed to be some sort of relationship between the work being done on the left side and the right side. And for now, of course, I'm using the words hands, and we know that that's not really relevant so much because we can juggle without our hands, but for this conversation, I think you understand the idea that there's some sort of balance. And again, it's not maybe equal. It means we have a ratio. We have some sort of relationship of the amount of action going on between the 2 halves of the body at least. So maybe there's a certain line, and if that balance goes below that line, the sequence becomes bad. I don't know. You can say that every sequence that's above a 60%, 40% ratio is good. I don't know. So some funny ideas like this. But as well, not in terms of the body working, but in terms of how the objects relate to each other. Because I think that's the most common mistake when somebody who is just starting out tries to make a composition of juggling, of technique in some way. It's very easy, especially if you don't have a lot of technique, to take one of the objects, let's say you have 3 objects, it's very easy to take one of the objects and then kind of stick it so it's away somewhere, and then do a lot of stuff with the other 2 objects. And in that way, the balance of work between the 3 objects is very unequal. It means these are getting most of the attention, and this one is basically being ignored. And again, maybe we have some sort of line or some sort of level where that relationship is acceptable, and above that line, it's going to be a good sequence still, but below that line, let's say, I only use this ball 10% of the time. Oh, that's my level. Below 10% of the time, the sequence is bad. And I know this is a little bit foolish. I mean, how can we really answer the question of what is good juggling from a technical standpoint in terms of composition, artistic expression, intent, and all these other things? But at least it was a funny starting point that I had never thought of before, and I've never seen anybody working with that before. So we made this thing called the Manipulation Research Laboratory. And the first laboratory is we wanted to define and try to see what is manipulation, and not just say what is manipulation, but say what is good manipulation and what is bad manipulation. Because so far it didn't seem to be getting anywhere in these workshops that I would go teach at juggling festivals for me just to say, well, this is manipulation, here's all the pieces of manipulation, here's all the techniques of manipulation, and now make a composition with that. It was still the same result as ever. The jugglers who kind of had this natural ability to compose, they did a good sequence. And the jugglers who just didn't get it, they still didn't get it. They still made bad juggling. So I wanted to fix this because, of course, if you're teaching a workshop, you want to help people out and have a success for everyone on some level. So we wanted to start to see what is manipulation and what is good manipulation and then what is bad manipulation. For sure, this opinion is subjective on an individual basis. Everybody has their own personal idea of what is good and bad. However, what I can say, which I think you'll agree with me, is that when you see juggling, you know there's juggling that you think is good. There's some juggling you see and you go, I like that. And there's some juggling that you see and you say, I don't like that. And even if it's not conscious inside of you, I'm guessing there is some sort of common quality in all of the juggling that you see that you like. Maybe you can't express it. Maybe some juggling that you see, it's three cigar boxes. I really like that juggling. And then maybe you see some shaker cup juggling. I really like that juggling too. And they don't maybe have something in common that's obvious, at least in terms of technique. But I think there is some sort of quality that is in common in those sequences that speak to you personally. And wouldn't it be great then if we could vocalize what that thing was, that quality, because then you could do it all the time, and you could make it even better. And you could start to judge work based upon this criteria, and it's not a mystery anymore. Because at this point, it's like, I'm just going to make a sequence and I hope you like it. I'm going to do my best, but we can't really talk about it with words. So how can we ever progress forward in terms of what we're trying to do? And maybe you see another cigar box sequence, 3 cigar box sequence, and you hate that one, but you liked the other one. Well, why is that? It's the same prop, it's the same technique, it's maybe even the same person. It's maybe even a section inside of the same piece of choreography or composition. Well, why is that? Why do I like this and why do I not like that? So we had some sort of ideas about how to test these theories and how to speak about these kinds of these concepts and how they might be applied in practice in real life to real work, to physical work. So it's not just an intellectual exercise to sit around, at lunchtime and just say, what do you think is good juggling and what do you think is bad juggling? But to take these ideas inside the studio or inside a room and actually practice and make work with them that's concrete. So the first exercise we're going to do from this manipulation research laboratory is that we started to test what I'm going to call object order. And again, it comes back to that idea, if I don't have a lot of technique, it's really easy for me to eliminate one of the objects, usually by doing a trap or a hold or a placement, and then doing a bunch of stuff with the other objects before ever coming back to that third one. Because it's just technically easier to get it out of the way. I don't have to deal with it as much. And I thought, wait a second, the ratio or the relationship between the amount of work or the amount of time I spend with each object, maybe there's a certain level that it has to stay at. There has to be a certain balance inside of these 3 objects. And if it falls below that line, maybe it's not nice anymore, or I don't like it anymore, or it's bad somehow. So the first thing we wanted to do was to start to test how can we understand the relationship between objects. And in that way, we took all of the videos we could find, In terms of the videos that I like juggling, I took a bunch of videos, and over here is all the videos that I like, that use 3 objects. And we stuck with three balls. It was more easy to count in this experiment. And then, of course, I took a bunch of videos that I didn't like, and said, okay, I don't like all of this juggling, and I tried to find videos of 3 balls. As well, we tried to find videos of juggling from the past. So Chris Cremo, for example, is a famous 3-ball juggler. And we tried to take videos that were personal. So I had videos of my own work with 3 balls, also from the past and from from the present, so that we could sort of see if there was a common quality between all of the things that we liked that were good and all of them that were bad. And we each had our own personal list, all of the participants inside of the laboratory. But for my list, I started to number the objects on the video screen. So for example, the blue ball I would say is 1, the red ball is 2, and the white ball is number 3. And of course, if the objects in the video weren't colored, I still just had to keep track and suffer through it like Chris Cremo's. All the balls are white, and it was a lot of stopping and pausing and rewinding and really trying to figure out what's happening. But then I just had a piece of paper, and I had a pen, and as I watched the video, I would just write down whenever the object moved. And for now we can say that the object was thrown or juggled, and that's also up to interpretation, but stick with me for a second. I just watching these videos, and I would just go 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 3, 3, 3, 3, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, etc., etc. And I would just document the entire routine as best as I could, and say, okay, Chris Cremo started off throwing this ball, then he threw it again, then he threw it again, then he threw ball number 2, then he used ball number 2 again, etc., right? You understand? And of course, this process is really subjective, it's really interpretive. It's almost impossible to have a very accurate map of the order of the objects in the sequence of the juggling. But we all made our best attempt. And of course, the pieces of paper were really filled up, and we had just numbers, you know, it's really, really long. I mean, in one routine, you just had a whole sheet of paper that was numbers. And so, what was really shocking is that inside these lists of numbers, we started to see patterns that would repeat. So for example, I would start to notice that there's a couple of 2s there, and oh, there's a couple of 2s there, for example. And as we went down the list, we started to see, oh, wow, there's other patterns of numbers. And at first, I thought, well, maybe this is a coincidence, because this is a pretty random process. But on the other hand, let's say this is for all of the good juggling videos. On the other hand, I had also my list of all the bad juggling videos. And I started to notice patterns of numbers in that list as well. And, as it turns out, those numbers, those patterns on the good list and the bad list were different. So then I thought, wow, I got a little bit scared for a second that this actually had worked. And I started to think a little bit more about this. And it turns out, from these results, not just my personal results, but from everybody participating in the laboratory, we all had the same patterns of numbers in the lists that were good, and we all had the same patterns of numbers in the lists that were the juggling we didn't like, or the juggling we thought was bad. So that was a real shock, that this sort of ghetto experiment actually kind of worked. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this list of numbers, let's say on my good juggling videos, I'm not saying that this list of numbers was perfect, so that every single number was a pattern, and everything worked out perfectly. But it happened enough, and it was consistent enough, that you could start to say that they were actually patterns of numbers, and they actually did emerge as a consistent thing. And another crazy thing that we noticed is that these patterns of numbers occurred not just with other jugglers who we liked to watch, but also inside of our own work. So my personal videos had the exact same patterns of numbers as, say, Chris Cremo or whoever I was watching. And this was a real shock too, for me at least, because personally, when I created these videos that I was watching of my work, say from the past, or from last week, or whatever, I never thought about a pattern of numbers. I never sat down with the 3 balls and numbered them and said, okay, now I'm going to throw ball number 2 twice in a row. I never did that consciously. But unconsciously, there seemed to be some sort of ratio in terms of the order of objects that was consistent in work that we thought was good, or, yeah, that looked complete, we could say. And as well, videos from the past, say from 50 years ago, we had the same pattern of numbers in the good and the bad lists, the different patterns from videos from 50 years ago as last week. So that was also a shock. So there seemed to be some sort of truth behind the results, that it wasn't just random or just based upon some sort of weird, trend and a technique from like 2 years ago. Because that could also be something too, 2 years ago maybe everybody juggled in this certain style for a few months, and maybe that would produce some patterns of numbers. But it seemed consistent, not just personally, but it applied kind of generally to the genre in one way, and also it kind of transcended time. It wasn't stuck in a particular era, as far as we could tell. Again, this is very imprecise, but it was concrete enough that I am telling it to you today, and it's something I really still believe in. And so, what we're talking about really clearly here is the order of objects. So we can say, let's say object order. And we're talking about the ratio between the objects. It means how much do you use each object in relationship to the other object inside of a composition, inside of your technique, and how you form the juggling. So, out of this object order, we had ratios, and of the ratios, we had 3 ratios that were the best. We had 3 ratios that were found more than any other ratio. And we're just talking about 3 balls, or 3 objects, you could say. It doesn't have to just be balls, but 3 objects. And again, you're numbering the objects, 1, 2, 3, and you're counting them in terms of how they are used. And then in terms of how they're used, that's a little bit subjective, a little bit interpretive, because you can do multiplexes, so sometimes they're used at the same time. You can do different techniques where you have to start to determine what is a throw and what is a catch, and where do those ideas start and stop to know when one object is being used and the other object is being used. Are they all being used all the time? How do you start to make these rules? So for now, we're just very relaxed about this. We don't have anything more specific than we have as a starting point this idea of these 3 ratios that were good. So let's see. Let's do good ones here. And of the good ratios we had, they were like this. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. So I want to explain this a little bit. Again, here, it's pretty obvious, but as a starting point, it's good. We have the ratio of 1, 2, 3. It means that when I'm doing my juggling sequence, and I'm making some juggling, let's say the blue ball is ball number 1. It means first I'm going to do something with ball number 1, and then after that, let's say the pink one is ball number 2, then I'll do something with this ball, and finally, of course, ball number 3 will be the white ball. It means, to be really stupid about this, I'm going to do something with this ball, and then I have to use this ball before I do anything with this ball or the first ball again, right? So if I move this ball, it means the next thing I do, I have to do with the pink ball. But what that thing is can be anything. It can be anything in the world. It can be a throw, kick, hit, trap, roll, bounce, slide, pinch, whatever you want to do. But it has to be done with that ball. And then finally, anything in the world, but it has to be done with the white ball, ball number 3. Before I can do anything with the first ball again. And in that way, we have this as a repeating pattern. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And for me personally, if you would have told me that as a result when I started this experiment, I wouldn't have believed you, because, for example, 1, 2, 3 sounds really boring to me. It doesn't sound like it's a good it wouldn't make something that's good juggling. Because it's the first thing that we ever do. The cascade is 1, 2, 3, right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So this is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the cascade is perhaps not the most exciting juggling you've ever seen in your life. But again, looking backwards, I start to understand a lot better why this is good, and we'll get there in the next one. It means that in the next ratio that's good, we have 1, 2, 2, 3. Again, if we go back to ball order, we have the first ball, it's the blue one. I do something with 1, then I do something with number 2, then I have to do something with number 2 again, and then I do something with number 3. So this second ball gets thrown twice. And the reason that this is good, looking backwards, it's a little bit obvious. It's because, first of all, in 1, 2, 3, we have an equal relationship between the balls. All of the balls are used exactly equally, and in that way, it's exciting in that the juggling is more filled out. You're not ignoring an object. For sure, in the sequence 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, you're not taking number 3 and putting it here and going 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Right? In that way, the ratio is really unequal. And this, it can't get more equal. And as well, it can't get more equal, but it's also very short. It's very fast. So no matter what happens with number 1, you're going to do that thing, you're going to do something with number 1 again really soon. So it has the potential to be quite exciting in one way. It's a really short pattern, and it's really equal. But in the second pattern, 1, 2, 2, 3, we have a surprise. So especially if you start here on the second 2, and you count 2, 3, 1, 2, you think you're going to say 3, right? But you don't, you say 2 again, and it's a surprise. You set up an expectation, and then you break it. And just to be clear, for now, we can also say it's not important the amount of which numbers we're talking about. We're only talking about a general ratio. So I could have just as well written 1, 2, 3, 3. It would mean the same thing, you understand? It just means it's not the specific object that has to be repeated twice. It's just that one of the objects has to do twice the amount of work of each of the other objects. And again, in that way, maybe it's easier to see, just for the moment, if I do make this a 3, again, this idea of surprise, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 3. It's like, wait a second. It's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's pretty understandable, pretty relatable. But then all of a sudden, if you're 1, 2, 3, 3, and there's another 3 in there, it breaks the pattern, it breaks the rhythm, and it makes it a little bit more interesting. And it's the same thing for the last ratio. This last ratio was the longest one we could have before it started to make juggling that was bad. And in this one, again, we have a really consistent pattern. And we could do it just as well to demonstrate the surprise if we do like this. Because now I'm setting up a pattern where I say 1, 1, 2, 2, 3. Instead of saying 3 again, I say 1, 1, right? I come back to the beginning. You expect there to be another 3. I set up this expectation that there's going to be two times each object, but then I break it. So 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, and then you kind of break that expectation of the last number not being there. So these ratios here produced what we called good juggling, at least what we agreed upon in the laboratory. And maybe this has changed over the years. This was about 10 years ago. But still, when I do teach, sometimes, and we work on this, we do the exercises, and it does still provide positive results. So I think there is some sort of truth in these ratios. Then on the other side, of course, we can say there were the bad. Everybody wants to know what the bad ones were. I mean, so did I, so I don't ever have to do them. And there were 3 bad ones, but the most interesting one, because there's really no point in spending a lot of time on what's bad. Why not work on what's good? But the worst one, we can say, the worst one you should never do on purpose is this one. 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. And of course, again, I mean, I am joking in one way. Of course you can do this if you want to make it good. Of course there's exception to these rules. Of course you can do 1, 2, 3 and make it terrible. But this was an average, this was a community, this was an overview of what we found inside of the work. So there was some sort of general truth about it. Of course, every single time, every single pattern I do, where I do the ratio 1, 2, 3, it's not going to be great or perfect or good. And every time I juggle like this, it's not going to be bad. But I could say in general, overall, as an average, what we found in these results collectively in this experiment was that this produced really bad juggling. And I can say why. I think, again, looking backwards, it's a little bit obvious. It's because, first of all, it's super long, and you get a little bit bored. So you're like 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 1, 1, 2, 2. It's just too repetitive. There's no rhythm that's surprising. It never breaks. So it's too long, and then again, there is no surprise. So every object is equal, yes. In the exact same way, every object is equal over here. But it's just too long. There's no surprise. The rhythm is too slow in one way. And it's too predictable. Whereas here, sure, all of the work is equal between all of the objects, but the one comes back again really soon. And then you can start to do other things with it. Here, the first object is used twice, and then it has 4 beats, or 4 movements to rest, to sit out. So it's really out of the action for a long time, if you look at the overall time of the sequence. But we don't have to worry about the bad thing today, or ever again, because now we're just going to look at the good ones and work with that for a little bit. So, the first thing I want to do is take the third ratio, which is 5 numbers long, and I want you to make a sequence using 3 objects, 3 balls, I suggest. Again, we're only here to learn these ideas as concepts. There's no point to start from the beginning with trying to do all these things with, say, 10 clubs, juggling, or whatever. Let's first learn the ideas and then apply it to our work in the way that when we understand it, we know what we're talking about. So, I suggest you start with 3 balls. Of course, you can do 3 of any objects you want. But 3 balls, and I want to try to do the ratio of the object order, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, and I want to do that through 2 times. It means the sequence we want to try to create right now is going to be it's going to be 10 moves long, right? 10 total moves long. We have 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, and then just do it again. 2, 2, 3, 3. So there's a few things to say about this. First of all, it doesn't have to be the same 5 moves, just repeated. So it doesn't have to be the same 5 moves. If I throw under my leg with the first object, I don't have to throw under the leg in the same way with it again when it comes back around, okay? The second thing is the sequence doesn't have to loop. So it doesn't have to go from this ending point here all the way back around to this point in an easy way. It doesn't matter. We're just doing 10 moves straight in a row with no connection from the beginning to the end. And just to say, each move can really be anything in the world that you want. So the only thing we're going to do is we're going to say object number 1, let's say it's the pink ball. What am I going to do with that pink ball? It doesn't matter. You can do like that, etc. You can do like that, you can do like that. And then of course you have to start to interpret things. And there's going to be a lot of questions that come up. So for example, you're going to say, okay, my move number 1 of my object number 1 is going to be like this. So, wait a second. Is this one movement or is this one movement? And then that's up to you to decide. I don't care, but what you have to do is you have to be consistent. So what you can't do is here on the first time say, well, that's my move. And then later on, when you get back to it again, or the same technique later on, you can't say, well, now this is my move. That's one move. Because what we're looking at is a ratio. So we have to have some sort of at least personal definition and personal consistency in how we understand our own technique. Right? So you can't just start changing the rules, again, just because it's convenient for you. That you get into a situation where you say, okay, I have to move this ball next, so it'd be really cool if I put it there, and it would be great if it went to this hand. It depends. If you count that as one move there, then you have to count that kind of technique as one move every other place. You can't just have a shifting definition on each moment of what a piece of technique is in terms of one move. So what we're trying to determine is a ratio and the amount of work that we use each object for. So in that way, keep it really simple. It's only going to be 10 throws long, 10 moves long, 10 pieces of technique long, 2 times through the sequence 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, and let's take 10 minutes for that. That's 1 minute per move. Sounds good. Let's do it. Okay, now we have 10 minutes to do the object order ratio of 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. It means it's 10 moves long with our 3 balls. And what we're doing now is only trying to understand the order in which the objects move. It means it has nothing to do with technique at all. And sometimes I like to take these patterns of numbers and try to do them as small as I can in the most minimal way possible. And that way, if we have a 1, 2, 2, 3, 3 times through 2 times, then it means I can do, for example, the most minimal technique I think possible in one way is we're going to say it's not even a throw, but it can just be a side swap 1, for example, or a hand across or whatever you want to do. So in that way I can say 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3 is the same pattern that we just did. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. But of course you can add in more technique if you want. It's just, what I mean is as jugglers, we have a starting point all the time of trying to make things so difficult, but it doesn't have to be difficult at all. We're only trying to understand the concept so that later on we can use it for what we want to do. And so if you can understand it using the most minimal technique possible, maybe it's faster and easier for you. But I'd love to see what you did so far, so let's check it out. Great, so I'm curious to see on your sequences that you made how you started to define your technique in terms of each individual part. Because now we're trying to count the objects and what they're doing, and we always start to have these problems of saying, for example, even in my minimal one, I did some shuffling of the order of the objects inside of my hand for the technical purposes. So for example, my 1, I went 2, and then I changed my grip for 2. So somebody could start to argue me and say, but wait a second, when you have that grip and you move that ball, you're moving it out of order. But then I can say to you, no, I'm not. In my world, I'm moving that ball and it has to move there, so the other ball is moving out of the way because of that ball. Kind of in the same way that if I lift my leg up and I'm moving and I want to catch the ball under my leg here, like we did, I'm not lifting my leg up on its own. I have it because there's a relationship to the object of what the object wants to do. In the same way here, I'm telling you, I'm trying to argue that this ball is going to come in, therefore this ball is not moving in terms of the focus. It is moving physically, but it's not moving on its own or out of nowhere. The same way as my leg's not just chilling, hanging out there, and now all of a sudden, oh, I'm going to catch a ball under it as well. But there's a reason why the leg's moving. So I'm kind of curious to see how you guys start to define each of your individual moves, because we each do have a different opinion about this idea of how the technique changes and where is the focus coming from, and how do we start to figure out what order the objects are moving in, because it is actually kind of hard sometimes. So what's your first move? What was your first thing you did? Can you count out maybe the first 2 or 3 throws out loud?
1, 2, 2, 3, 3.
Okay, good. But that's a good example there. Already from that, you have this idea of a 2, 2. So the first 2 was a throw, and the second 2 was a hit or a bounce or something. Which, I mean, you could interpret it if you wanted to. You could say that that is one move. It's just that later on you have to understand what you're talking about. So you can start to coordinate your technique in terms of the time span of each movement of the object. And that way, if I say that this is 2 moves, it means maybe 2 times that I touch it somehow, or 2 different actions, or there's 2 directions that the ball is given. There's first this direction here, and then I give it a new direction with the arm bounce. Or then secondly, if I say it's just 1 move, I say, yeah, but the overall timing of that move is within my range of what I accept as 1 move. So there are these different ways to interpret this idea, but still, as long as you're consistent, which I think what I saw you do was consistent, then I think it's okay. We don't have to all agree exactly on what 1 move is. But how would you count out some of your moves?
So
The first few?
like 1, 2, 2.
Right, so you also had an arm. Almost the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, throw.
1, 2, 2, and then 3, 3.
Yeah, great. Okay, cool. And yours? How did you count your start?
Right, so I had 1, 2, 2, and the 3 comes there, and 3, 3.
Right.
Same bounce.
Yeah.
1. Right. 2, 2, 3, 3.
Right, so we have these techniques here where we're mixing the throws and we're mixing with these placements. And in one way, it can be difficult to understand, especially if you're just starting out with this kind of technique. In one way, you can interpret it and say that a throw goes up and down. And that way, a placement in one way, literally, you could say it's going up, and then it never comes back down. Or you could say that the up is this or something, and then it's down here. So the peak is in the middle of the path. There's a lot of different ways to interpret this, but what I'm saying is sometimes it can be difficult to understand what a single move is, because in the cascades we're always throwing, and it's pretty clear when that object starts and stops. At least for now, it's pretty clear, right? You're going to have a hard time arguing me that it starts now and ends there for today. But a placement or a hold, again, is kind of outside sometimes of this normal juggling rhythm in terms of the rhythm of what's happening inside the pattern. Here it's pretty clear what's the tempo. You can hear it very easily. But here, if I put a placement, you don't really hear anything. It's not a natural tempo. It's also not a visual tempo that you can see. It's an internal rhythm of the structure of the pattern, of the rhythm of the pattern. And in that way, it's easy to get lost in your head when you're thinking about, okay, when does this move start? When does it end? But again, I think what you did was consistent, and it's believable. So I don't think you had a problem in terms of yourself getting lost or figuring that out. But it can be hard when you're starting out to understand, wait a second, this is a placement, and then this hand's going to throw, but did that ball also move? And just don't get stuck. Just try to do your best and see if your rules are consistent as you go. But don't get stuck as a first step that you're saying, oh, I don't know if this is okay or not. It's certainly okay as a starting point. But then after that, it depends on what happens, if it's going to remain okay or if you have to change it. And what was some of your throws?
So I had 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. And then I had a bounce.
Yeah. And one thing I want to say, I mean, especially seeing your sequence, that I think is really important about this whole work that we're doing now, it's that, again, when I was watching my own video of my own work from 20 years ago, and I started to discover this same 1, 2, 2, 3, 3 pattern inside of that work that I did so many years ago that I never thought about. I never sat down 20 years ago and said, okay, this is ball number 1, so it's going to go once, and then ball number 2, what am I going to do with that? I didn't think about it. It just came out in the work organically somehow. And so what I think, watching all of your juggling now after doing this, is I think it looks like juggling. I don't know if it's the best juggling I've ever seen. I don't know if it's the worst juggling I've ever seen. Some of it I love, some of it I maybe like less than the other parts of it. But nevertheless, at least we could maybe agree, I don't know what you think, I think it looks like juggling. And I think that's really weird because we're here in a really strange situation. We're in a classroom, we're doing some teaching thing, some workshop thing. I give you a strange series of numbers. It's nothing you ever probably thought about before, at least in this very specific way. And yet what you made within 10 minutes using this system was still somehow some juggling that I recognized as juggling in a pretty clear way. Because I think on one hand, naturally, if you would tell me about this assignment without actually juggling it, I could imagine that the juggling that would result from it is very robotic, or it looks very contrived, or it looks strange or weird or just stiff somehow. But I don't know, it looks like you guys did some juggling. And so therefore I do think there is some sort of truth behind the numbers, whether it's a great, exact, precise system to test if something is good or not. That's maybe you can argue that. But in general, I think there is something about this relationship between the objects that makes juggling. At least, and I think it was proven again now, at least in my eyes. I don't know what you guys think, but it looks like juggling to me, which I'm always surprised about, because it seems like a random idea. Okay, what we're going to do next is the same thing, but with another one of the ratios. Now that we've practiced and sort of understood what the idea is, let's try it one more time, and maybe now we can be even a little bit more, I don't know, smarter about it, but more experienced at least. So let's take 1, 2, 2, 3, and let's do that through 3 times. It means we're going to have 12 moves in our sequence. And now thinking about this, especially from our first experience of using the other pattern of numbers, the first thing we could also think about is if you have a hard time understanding what you're doing, you could use 3 different colored objects. And sometimes I do that, of course. It's much easier to understand the numbers of the objects instead of having them all be the same color. So if you're having a problem, especially on the first time through, it's good that you can use different colors of objects. But as well, you can start to think that what kind of techniques can you use? And now we had seen some of the techniques you did use and how you counted them out with your own personal idea about what you're doing. So you have these throws with an arm bounce, for example. But you can also start to think that, again, in this kind of work, we're only caring about the ratio of the object order. That's all. We don't care about technique at all. It's only to understand how the objects move in relationship to each other. So I had my little minimal example before where I was just doing juggling like that. But in fact, we can start to think now, when we go through these 12 moves, what kind of techniques you can use to make this easier, if you want to. If you had a problem the first time through, then we can start to say that we do have these techniques that are placements, for example, which I talked about before, where these placements are out of time. So the rhythm, again, is not naturally that I'm going to move this ball. There's nothing forcing me to move this ball other than I decide I want to move the ball. And these kind of techniques are great when you're trying to learn something. So for example, if I'm going to try to juggle this sequence, it's maybe much better that I start to say, okay, ball number 1, move number 1 is going to be like this. Because then I do have the chance to sit there and think, and go, okay, this is ball number 2, what am I going to do? Ball number 2 is going to go like this. And then I also have the chance to think next, what's going to happen to ball number 2 again? It's much different if I would say, okay, this is ball number 1, and this is ball number 2. So ball number 1 is going to be this, and then 2 is that, and like, you have to think in the moment, it's too fast. We know how juggling goes like that. Of course you can break it down and do throws. You all did throws very well. But if you get stuck on this kind of work, because now the sequence is longer, it's going to be 12 moves long instead of 10. So if you want to have time to think and move and learn the moves in a little bit easier way, perhaps, if you need more time, you can think about these techniques in a different way. These more broken down techniques of traps and placements. As well, when we make the new sequence through, we can start to think, where do the objects start and where do they end? Because we don't have any rule about that. We don't have any traditional idea, again, that this has to loop back to the beginning when you're done. We don't have any idea that we have to do some sort of toss juggling, or that the objects have to start on our bodies. The objects could start anywhere. They could start on the floor, on a chair, somewhere in the environment. Maybe 1 can start in your hand and 2 can start on the floor. They can come and go from anywhere. Because if you remember, we had the object category. In the object category, we have objects' relationship to the environment as one of the subcategories of that. So we can use all of these things we can use them to our advantage, but also it could make this a little bit easier if you want to. The last thing I want to say before we do this is we're going to have 10 minutes to do this again, so now we're going to have to work even faster. We have 12 moves in 10 minutes. Another great thing about doing work like this and having a time limit is that you're going to practice remembering things. So remembering things is the exact same kind of technique as 5-ball juggling. The more you practice remembering things, the better you are at remembering things. It's practicing anything, you're going to get better at that skill. And if those are skills that you're interested in, then you need to practice them very consciously. I remember I had one year where I did a 6-month-long practice with clubs. I was making some sort of club sequence, and I never filmed it. And then I got busy with some other project, and 6 months later I came back and I had forgotten the entire sequence. And I was so sad on that day. I mean, it was 6 months of work gone. And of course I have this fantasy that the sequence was really good. I don't know if it was or not, but it just hurts me that it's gone. I don't know if it was good or not. And ever since then, I've been really conscious about practicing how to remember things. As well, we have 10 minutes to do this sequence. It's not a long time. It's less than a minute per move. And in that way, it forces you to make choices. So you don't have to make the best choice in the world. If you don't know what to do, this first throw, this first move with the first ball, it doesn't have to be genius. It doesn't have to be anything. It can be that. It can be that. It doesn't matter. Just make a choice and move forward. We're not interested in technique. We're not interested in quality of technique even. We're going to let the pattern, the ratio, the order of what we're doing, we're going to let that determine if what we're doing is good or not. Because now we're only looking at object order. So don't get stuck on technique or tricks or technique that you can't do. If you're doing tricks and you're dropping in this process, just cut it or move it or change it. It's not about that. It's about just only this one thing that we're looking at right now. So let's try this. 10 minutes, 1, 2, 2, 3, through, times 3, times, through. Yes. We had 10 minutes to do 1, 2, 2, 3. Through 3 times, so we had 12 moves. And again, before I had this example where I was just doing the most minimal technique possible, so I was just giving the balls back and forth like this. Now I can do the same pattern of the same task we just did, but with, let's say, cascade throws, or throws in the air, the most simple throws we can do. So I have throws that are going in a cascade or across, and just throws that go straight up and down, back to the same hand. And that way I can do, let's see, 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2. If I just keep looping it. So that's the same pattern with the most minimal, in one way, some of the most minimal technique that you can use. But let's see what you did.